The next leg of our Wild West railroading adventure would be spent in Utah. To get there, we would drive through Northern California on to Reno, Nevada, and beyond, following the original route of the Transcontinental Railroad to the Beehive State. On February 4th, 2016, we started our journey east by chasing trains on one of America's toughest railroad grades, Donner Pass. When it comes to Wild West railroading, few places compare to the geographical challenges of Northern California. Home to the infamous Donner Pass, Union Pacific's Roseville Sub is a difficult railroad to operate, especially during the winter. After spending time on 2 California coastal railroads the previous day, we found ourselves trackside on Yuba Pass, about 25 miles west of Truckee, California. We hiked several miles in deep snow to catch freight trains tackling the mountain grade. Our first train was a westbound intermodal, which included UP's Southern Pacific Heritage Unit, SD70 ACE, number 1996. After seeing our first train at Yuba Pass, we moved several thousand feet to the east on the opposite side of the second tunnel. There, we caught our second train, another intermodal. Later in the day, we caught both Amtrak California Zephyrs east of Truckee at a location called Hinton. After seeing the two passenger trains, we drove northeast and spent the night in Reno, Nevada. In the morning, we would continue our eastward journey to Utah by following Union Pacific's Nevada sub. We caught a high-priority westbound Union Pacific train at Lovelock, Nevada, with 3 units on the point. A brand new Tier 4 Jiva was trailing, and a DPU was shoving on the rear. Less than 5 minutes later, the local train sped by our cameras with a solo SD40N running long hood forward. Moving on, we continued east, where we caught 2 more trains at a location called Oriana, just off Interstate 80. The first train was one of the railroad's highest in priority, the eastbound Salad Shooter, which hauls freshly picked produce shipped from the West Coast.
Total axle 112. Train speed 55 mph. Temperature 45 degrees. Detector out.
About 10 minutes later, we caught a high-priority auto rack train with an SD70 ACE leading the train west. On the rear, another ACE would be acting as the DPU.
Total axle 284. Train speed 67 mph. Temperature 45 degrees. Detector out.
Further east, at a location called Rye Patch, Nevada, we caught another westbound intermodal train with an AC-45 CCTE leading the way. Why such a strange classification of a GE Evolution Series locomotive? Well, Union Pacific chose to have their ES-44s equipped with CTE software. Simply put, the software is used to reduce the tractive effort of a locomotive when it's used as a DPU in mixed freight type service. The higher tractive effort of the AC units when mid-train or on the rear can be too much for lighter trains. This isn't necessarily the case in bulk commodity service though, such as unit coal or grain trains. The UP System Special Instructions cites that the units are limited to 110,000 pounds in tractive effort when in CTE mode. Later in the day, we caught a short manifest train southwest of Argenta, Nevada, along the Humboldt River. It would be our last train of the day, and we would continue our drive in the dark to Provo, Utah. The next morning, on February 6th, we found ourselves in Heber City, Utah, home of the Heber Valley Railroad. This heritage railroad operates weekly excursion trains through Provo Canyon on 16 miles of track using historic diesel locomotives to pull the trips. Once upon a time, they operated a small Union Pacific steam locomotive, but it's been out of service for several years now. Today's locomotive would be an EMD MRS-1 with a unique sounding air whistle. The Heber Valley Railroad was originally a Rio Grande branch line that connected Heber City with Provo, Utah. The line was completed in 1899 and proved to be somewhat of a profitable branch until the early 1960s. Rio Grande operated freight service on the line until its abandonment in 1967. The line was saved for tourist use and was reopened in 1970 when steam locomotive number 618 and other equipment was relocated from Provo. The track between Provo and Vivian Park was later removed and converted into a recreational trail. This means the Heber Valley is completely isolated from the North American rail network. During the 1970s and 80s, the railroad operated as the Heber Creeper. In the late 1980s, this railroad went out of business. Citizens in the Heber area successfully petitioned the state of Utah to help save the railroad, leading to the creation of the Heber Valley Historic Railroad Authority in the early 90s. Since this time, the railroad has seen considerable growth. The railroad operates as a nonprofit 501c3 organization. After documenting the short excursion trip on the Heber Valley, we found an eastbound BNSF train with CSX foreign power on Union Pacific rails at Colton, Utah. Today, Union Pacific's Provo sub is a busy main line that sees through traffic from both BNSF and Utah Railway. Since Utah Railway's coal trains were operated on weekdays, we followed the BNSF manifest train towards Crescent Junction, Utah, where we overnighted in Moab in anticipation of chasing UP's Potash Local on the Cane Creek subdivision the following day. Today's Utah Railway operates over 423 miles of track between Grand Junction, Colorado, and Provo, Utah, of which 45 miles are owned and the remainder operated under agreements with BNSF Railway. Up until 2017, the company hauled a significant amount of coal, averaging 60,000 carloads hauled each year. The railroad moves an additional 30,000 carloads of general freight over a subsidiary company, the Salt Lake City Southern, which serves over 30 customers on over 25 miles of track between Salt Lake City and Draper, Utah. The railroad line dates back to the early 1880s, when the predecessors of the Denver and Rio Grande Western completed a 3-foot narrow gauge line through the Royal Gorge, over Marshall Pass, through the Black Canyon of the Gunnison, across the Utah Desert, and over Soldier Summit. It was rebuilt to a standard gauge railroad in 1890 and continues to serve Union Pacific as a main line. after documenting the train in Carbonville, we jumped ahead of the eastbound manifest for another shot near Green River, Utah. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, we caught the train one last time west of Crescent Junction. It's easy to picture the famous Rio Grande, California Zephyr skirting across the desert at this very location. The following morning, Sunday, February 7th, we found Union Pacific's Potash local between Brindle and Moab, Utah. This 36-mile-long branch line is known as the Cane Creek Sub. The line was built in 1963 by the Denver and Rio Grande Western to serve a large potash plant southwest of Moab. The motive power on train LDC 53 this day consisted of 2 EMDs, with the leader being a former Rio Grande unit on home rails. It was a pleasant surprise to see EMD 4-axles in charge of the train, as opposed to the typical GE 6-axle power common to this line. The Cane Creek Sub has a general track speed of 30 miles per hour until it reaches Bootlegger's Tunnel near Moab, where the speed restriction is marked at 10 miles per hour. The line has 3 significant grades, with one near milepost 12 and the other 2 on both sides of 7-mile siding. The ruling grade is estimated at just over 1%, with the only real siding and station being at 7 Mile. The Potash Local operates only one day per week, which is typically on Fridays. The only other traffic occurs when Union Pacific serves an UMTRA radioactive waste site just outside of Moab. The UMTRA facility focuses on the removal of radioactive soil that had been affected by uranium ore tailings, which were dumped by the former Atlas Minerals Corporation. The site is situated on the west bank of the Colorado River and encompasses 480 acres. of which approximately 130 acres is covered by a uranium mill tailings pile. The Cane Creek subdivision is considered by many to be one of the most beautiful stretches of railroad in the United States. With many geological landmarks, bridges, the paralleling Colorado River, and a long tunnel, the branch offers rail fans many unique photographic opportunities. As the tracks exit the 7,000-foot-long Bootleggers Tunnel at the West End Portal, trains pass by the famous Corona Arch. The geological landmark is just outside of Arches National Park, but it's clearly visible from the railroad's right-of-way. Since it involves a rather long hike back to the cut where the Corona Arch can be photographed, we were unable to capture the train alongside it. Downgrade, we caught the train several times before it arrived at Intrepid Mining's Potash plant, where the crew would drop off empties and pick up loads before heading back to Brendel. Potash is the name for a class of moderately refined mixes of potassium salts. It primarily consists of potassium oxide and chloride, depending on application, but also of other potassium salts and impurities. It's mainly used as a fertilizer and can be found in abundance in Utah. These potassium salts are the result of an ancient ocean that once encompassed the state of Utah during prehistoric times. In order to reach the salts, deep underground mines must be constructed. In the early 1960s, Texas Gulf Sulfur began to dig an underground potash mine about 15 miles from Moab, Utah, halfway between Arches and Canyonlands National Parks along the Colorado River. In order to move the large quantities of potash, the Denver and Rio Grande Western contracted Morrison Knutson to construct a branch from their main line at Brendel, Utah, to the mine, a total of 36 miles. The line was completed in 1963, but Texas Gulf Sulfur did not ship product until about 1965. The mine was originally projected to produce 12,000 tons of potash every day. So for the Rio Grande, building a long branch line to serve just one customer was worth it. However, the mine never reached its full production capacity, which meant it was decades before the initial investment by the railroad was paid off. Mining potash by manual labor is a dangerous business. The year the plant opened, an explosion trapped 25 miners, killing 18. The 7 survivors lived by building a barricade to trap fresh air. In 1970, the mine was converted from manual labor to solution mining. Solution mining involves using wells to inject water deep into the deposits, which then dissolves the salts into the water, forming a brine. Solution mining is much safer and has been a practice at Moab for over 50 years. Once extracted through other wells, the brine is then pumped into giant ponds. The ponds are visible from the air and are easy to find, since they resemble hues of aqua, blue, and purple. Since the area surrounding Moab has extremely low humidity and averages 300 days of direct sunlight every year, these colorful brine ponds act as giant solar collectors, evaporating the water and leaving a bed of salt crystals behind. The crystals are then picked up with large vehicles and hauled off to the plant, where the materials are refined for purity before being separated for use in various products. The Texas Gulf Sulphur Moab site was acquired by the Potash Corporation of Saskatchewan in 1995, which was later acquired by Intrepid Potash in 2000. Today, the company is the largest producer of potash in the United States. After the train traveled east through Bootlegger's Tunnel, we caught the now northbound local several times before it arrived at Brendel. The lead locomotive on the return trip was Union Pacific No. 1482, a GP40M-2 that was acquired by Southern Pacific Railroad from the B&O. It was originally built in March of 1969 and was eventually acquired by and rebuilt by the SP, which was later taken over by Union Pacific in 1996. After chasing the Potash local back to Crescent Junction, we would make our way back to Provo for an early morning chase of the Utah Railway. In the early morning hours, we caught up with an empty Utah Railway coal train at Carbonville that was en route to the Savage Coal Terminal in Wellington. At Wellington, we observed the train at the coal tipple as it was being loaded for its journey back west. At the time, it took Savage roughly 4 hours to load a 100-car-long coal train. The Utah Railway was incorporated on January 24, 1912. Utah Railway's parent company was United States Fuel, a subsidiary of United States Smelting, Refining, and Mining Company, which owned extensive coal fields in east-central Utah. The railway was created to haul coal from the company's mines to Provo as a reaction to high shipping rates from the Rio Grande. It was originally named the Utah Coal Railway, but was shortened to Utah Railway in May of the same year. The Utah Railway quickly became known for owning the most modern steam locomotives. When first built, its large Santa Fe and Malley-type steam locomotives had automatic stokers, a new invention at the time and a convenience that drew many firemen from the Rio Grande's Utah division to the Utah Railway. In addition, the Utah Railway was the first to equip its air brakes with 14-pound tension springs instead of the then industry-standard 7-pound springs. The company was one of the earliest coal-hauling railroads to employ diesel locomotives and was early to adopt automation technologies, including the use of flashing rear-end devices instead of cabooses. Today, the Utah Railway is owned and operated by Genesee and Wyoming under the reporting mark Utah. Genesee and Wyoming is a short-line holding company that operates 122 railroads worldwide and is known for its bright orange, black, and yellow paint scheme. Utah was acquired by Genesee and Wyoming in 2002. In 2016, the Utah was primarily a coal-hauling railroad, but other commodities included aggregates, brick, cement, building materials, chemicals, and petroleum products. At the time this video was recorded, Savage was the only remaining coal terminal served by the Utah Railway. Due to the changes seen in the coal industry at the time that included strict environmental regulations under the Obama administration, one by one, the mines along the Utah Railway closed. Only one weekly coal train served the Savage facility in 2016. These trains were transferred to the Union Pacific in Provo for the final leg of their journey to the Intermountain Power Project plant near Delta, Utah. Later in the year, rumors began to circulate that the Utah Railway was about to lose their contract with Savage. Those rumors were confirmed in the fall when it was announced that the last Utah Railway coal trains to the power plant would be running through the end of 2016. However, due to the tonnage hauling contract between the Utah and the power plant, The last official train ran on January 16, 2017. We at Delay in Block were unaware of Utah's dire outlook on the coal business at the time, so we didn't consider just how fortunate we were to document this train. Looking back, we're glad we did. While at Wellington, the corporately painted locomotives from the head end were transferred to the mid-train helper crew. Unless they were rearranging the motive power just for us, this move didn't make much sense because it created a lot of extra work for the crews. Nonetheless, we were blessed with an opportunity to document an all red and gray Utah Railway locomotive consist between Wellington and Provo. The city of Helper, Utah was settled in 1881 when the Rio Grande first arrived on the scene. The name is derived from the railroad since Helper locomotives were tagged onto the rear of westbound freight trains to make the grade over Soldier Summit, the fifth highest railroad pass on a U.S. transcontinental railroad. At the railroad's arrival, Helper began to develop as a population center. By 1887, the Rio Grande had built about 20 company-owned homes for railroad workers and their families, with more built later that year. The railroad planned to make Helper a freight terminal after the rail lines were changed from narrow to standard gauge. The changeover process began in 1889 and was completed in 1891. 1 year later, Helper was made the division point between the eastern and western Rio Grande terminals in Grand Junction, Colorado and Ogden, Utah, and a new depot, hotel, and other buildings were constructed as a result. After catching the train several times between Helper and Soldier Summit, the train stopped for a crew change. This location is at the peak of
the hill. Every division has a hill somewhere that's called the ruling grade. It's the steepest hill on that piece of the railroad. And it's a daily operating obstacle for the railroad running heavy freight trains.
The locomotive leading the train on this day was an MK50-3, originally developed by MK Rail as an MK5000C, a 5,000 horsepower diesel-electric locomotive. When it was introduced in 1994, the model was the most powerful single prime-mover diesel-electric locomotive ever made, a title it held for only 1 year until GE produced its 6,000 horsepower AC6000 in 1995. The MK5000C appears very similar to many 1990s era EMD products, having a fuel tank and long hood that appear very similar to EMD designs. Internally, however, the original designs for the MK5000C shared very little in common with any EMD product. In the early 1990s, MK Rail, a longtime locomotive rebuilder and a division of Morrison Knudsen, announced its plan to compete directly with EMD and GE by beginning its own high-horsepower locomotive program, starting out with a 5,000 horsepower DC drive locomotive, with future plans of offering both a 5,500 and 6,000 horsepower AC locomotive. In response to the MK Rail program, GE announced the AC6000, and EMD announced the 5,000 horsepower SD80 Mac, and later the 6,000 horsepower SD90 Mac. A total of 6 examples were built, 3 in August of 1994 for demonstration on the Southern Pacific, and another 3 in August of 1995 for demonstration on Union Pacific. Due to termination of the MK Rail high horsepower program, neither of the railroad companies purchased the model, and the units were returned after 1 year of demonstrations. Production was stopped after the sale of MK Rail in 1996, and 3 more partially built units sat in storage until 2001, when their frames were scrapped by MK Rail's successor, Motive Power Industries. In the year 2000, Utah Railway purchased all 6 units from Wabtec, the owner of Motive Power Industries. However, due to problems with the main bearings on the CAT 3612 diesel engine and Kato main alternator, the units were returned to Wabtec, which replaced the components with an EMD AR11 main alternator. At the same time, the engine blocks were replaced by EMD's 16 645 F3B diesel engines from 5 retired Union Pacific SD50s and 1 retired GP50, giving the locomotives 3,500 horsepower. The 6 units were reclassified as MK50-3s and were returned to the Utah Railway in 2003. Downgrade, we would catch the train several times as it made its way back to Provo. We'd like to thank Bevan Wall Productions for providing audio for this segment of the video. Unfortunately, our audio equipment was malfunctioning throughout the chase. The result was corrupted audio that took away from the beautiful winter scenery. Thanks to Bevan, who chased the Utah Railway in 2014, we were able to dub in accurate audio for the remainder of the video. Go check out his excellent videos by searching for Rock Solid Railroad videos on YouTube. After catching the train at grade level, we set up east of Thistle before the train entered the tunnel off Highway 89. We had to hike down the edge of a steep hill in deep snow to grab this shot. The result was a magnificent view of the valley below. We drove straight to Provo, where we caught the coal train at track speed one final time. Though we were unaware of it, we were watching history unfold before our eyes. 1 year later, coal operations on the Utah would cease forever, or so we thought. In 2020, a revived, albeit limited, coal operation began on the Utah Railway, with weekly 14-car coal trains making the round trip between Provo and Savage. It remains to be seen what the future of the Utah Railway holds. Thank you for watching Delay in Block Productions. We hope you enjoyed part 3 of our Wild West railroading adventure. Until next time, happy railroading.